Welcome back, everyone. Before we dive into today's unbelievable story, I'd like to ask for your support. If you haven't subscribed yet, now is the perfect time. Hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. It costs nothing, but it makes a huge difference for our channel. And don't leave without telling us where you're watching from today. Seeing viewers from different cities and countries is one of the best parts of this community. Thanks so much. Now, let's meet today's main character. People think the biggest mistake is crossing a property line. It is not. The biggest mistake is ignoring the person who already warned you where it is. The first mature oak tree was already hanging 30 feet above the ground when I realized Rebecca Whitmore had committed herself too far to turn back. A hydraulic crane slowly lifted the enormous root ball into the cool Texas morning while thick steel cables creaked under the weight. The steady rumble of diesel engines echoed across the open pasture as backup alarms bounced through the quiet countryside, scattering meadowlarks into the cedar trees lining the horizon. Fresh black mulch had already been spread across the newly shaped landscape beds, and the smell of damp earth mixed with hydraulic oil drifted toward my front porch before I even finished opening the screen door. From where I stood, I could see a convoy of contractor trucks stretching all the way to the subdivision entrance. Flatbed trailers carried more mature oak trees waiting to be planted. Pallets of limestone edging stood neatly stacked beside irrigation pipe, landscape lighting, flowering shrubs, and rolls of fresh sod ready to transform the entrance into exactly what the Homeowners Association had promised its residents. It looked impressive. It also happened to be sitting on land that legally belonged to me. I walked slowly across the grass with a waterproof survey binder tucked beneath my arm, never taking my eyes off the bright orange survey ribbon still tied to the original steel monument my family had relied on for decades. It stood only a few feet away from the freshly dug planting holes, almost daring someone to admit it existed. Rebecca stood near the center of the operation wearing a crisp white blazer beneath a reflective safety vest, confidently reviewing architectural renderings while calmly directing contractors from one section of the project to the next. She looked completely certain every decision had already been approved. I unfolded the certified survey across the hood of a contractor's truck and waited until several workers gathered close enough to see the county seal printed across the top of the document. "You need to stop," I said calmly. "Every tree being planted today is crossing onto private property." For a brief second, the site became almost silent except for the idle rumble of heavy equipment. Several contractors looked toward Rebecca instead of answering me. She removed her sunglasses, glanced at the survey for no more than a moment, then smiled as though I had interrupted nothing more important than a routine landscaping meeting. "We are improving the neighborhood," she replied without the slightest hesitation. "Once they are in the ground, nobody is going to rip out 40 mature oaks." A few workers shifted uncomfortably, but nobody shut down an engine. Rebecca simply nodded toward the crane operator. The massive oak slowly descended into the waiting hole, while workers secured irrigation lines beneath the root ball and spread rich black mulch around the trunk. Decorative limestone followed immediately afterward, creating the appearance of a permanent entrance that had never belonged anywhere else. I looked down at the original steel survey monument where fresh tire tracks had partially buried its base beneath loose soil. With the toe of my boot, I brushed away the dirt until the metal marker was visible again. Then I looked back at Rebecca. "I have warned you more than once," I said quietly. "Everything you build after today becomes evidence." She laughed softly before turning back toward the contractors as though the conversation had already ended. What she could not possibly know was that I had spent years documenting every inch of this property, and sometimes the fastest way to win is not stopping someone from making an expensive mistake. Sometimes it is allowing them to finish it completely before the truth finally catches up. My name is Cole Harrison, and long before expensive entrance monuments and neighborhood committees ever appeared, this land already had a history. My grandfather bought these 26 acres in 1961 when the nearest paved road was still miles away and the surrounding fields stretched farther than anyone could see. As a child, I learned to recognize every fence corner, every creek crossing, every old oak tree, and every steel survey monument marking the property boundaries. My grandfather always reminded me that fences could be replaced, roads could be widened, and neighbors could come and go, but a recorded property line remained exactly where the law placed it. At the time, I thought those conversations were simply lessons about ranching. Years later, I realized they were lessons about patience. I eventually became a civil engineer because I trusted measurements more than assumptions. Concrete either met specifications or it failed inspection. Drainage either followed the design or flooded after the first heavy rain. Property boundaries worked the same way. They were established by surveys, deeds, and county records, not by confidence or popularity. After inheriting the property, one of the very first things I did was hire a licensed surveyor to verify every original boundary monument. We walked the entire perimeter together beneath the summer sun, locating each galvanized steel marker before documenting its exact position with certified equipment. Fresh orange survey ribbon was tied to every monument. New drawings were prepared, and certified copies were filed with the county before additional copies were stored inside waterproof binders in my workshop. Some people considered that unnecessary. I considered it inexpensive insurance against future misunderstandings. For years, my life remained pleasantly predictable. I maintained the fences, repaired the barn, planted a vegetable garden every spring, and watched neighboring subdivisions slowly replace open pasture beyond my eastern property line. The homeowners who lived there were friendly enough. We waved when we passed each other on the county road, occasionally exchanged conversations about weather or wildlife, and respected the simple understanding that my land ended where the survey said it ended. I had never argued with the homeowners association because my property had never belonged to it. My deed had been recorded decades before the subdivision was even imagined. Looking back now, I can still remember the afternoon when the first small warning appeared. It was nothing more than a few bright orange wooden stakes standing several feet inside my eastern pasture. At first, I assumed a utility contractor had accidentally crossed the line while preparing another nearby project. I photographed the stakes anyway before carefully comparing their location with my certified survey that evening. They were unquestionably inside my property. The following morning, the stakes had multiplied. Fresh white spray paint curved across the native grass, while colored utility flags fluttered gently in the breeze beside areas that had never been disturbed before. The faint smell of marking paint still lingered in the warm air as I quietly photographed everything again from multiple angles. Instead of pulling the new markers out, I left every one of them exactly where they stood. Something told me those tiny pieces of wood would eventually become the first chapter of a much larger story, and experience had already taught me that the strongest evidence is often collected long before anyone realizes it will one day matter. Rebecca Whitmore did not look like someone who would deliberately create a property dispute. She looked like the kind of person who organized neighborhood events, remembered everyone's birthday, and always stood smiling in front of ribbon cuttings for the local newspaper. That was exactly why so many homeowners trusted her judgment without asking questions. During the 5 years she served as president of the Homeowners Association, she transformed ordinary projects into polished community improvements that everyone admired. Decorative flower beds appeared near the entrance, new streetlights illuminated sidewalks, seasonal banners welcomed visitors, and freshly landscaped common areas quickly became neighborhood landmarks. Every presentation she delivered featured colorful architectural renderings, carefully prepared budgets, and confident promises that each improvement would increase property values. Most residents only saw attractive results. They never noticed how easily confidence slowly replaced caution. The first time I met Rebecca in person was during an open community presentation about what she proudly introduced as the Gateway Beautification Project. Although my property had never belonged to the association, one of my neighbors invited me because the proposed entrance bordered my eastern pasture. Inside the clubhouse, large display boards showed mature oak trees, decorative limestone walls, flowering shrubs, elegant landscape lighting, and a redesigned entrance stretching far beyond the existing subdivision road. As the audience applauded the presentation, I quietly studied the scaled drawings displayed across the room. Within seconds, something immediately caught my attention. The proposed landscape corridor extended well beyond the subdivision boundary and continued directly across my recorded property line. At first, I assumed the graphic designer had simply made a drafting mistake. After the presentation ended, I walked over carrying a folded copy of my certified survey. "I believe your plan crosses onto my property," I said politely while pointing toward the boundary shown on both documents. Rebecca glanced at my survey for only a brief moment before returning her attention to the presentation board. Our engineering consultant assured us this entrance area has always functioned as part of the community, she replied with complete confidence. I remained calm. Function does not establish ownership. County records do. She smiled politely, folded the rendering, and answered with a sentence I would remember for months afterward. Sometimes paperwork does not reflect what is best for the neighborhood. There was no anger in her voice, only certainty. That certainty concerned me far more than an argument ever could have. During the following weeks, unfamiliar contractor vehicles began appearing near my eastern fence line. Survey crews rolled measuring wheels through the grass, while bright orange paint marked gentle curves across areas that had never been disturbed before. Wooden stakes multiplied almost daily, each standing a little farther inside my property than the last. The faint smell of fresh marking paint mixed with cut grass drifted through the afternoon air as utility flags fluttered quietly beside the original steel survey monuments. Every evening, I photographed the new markings before organizing the images alongside my certified surveys, county plats, and property records. Neighbors enthusiastically discussed the beautiful entrance that would soon welcome everyone into the subdivision. Meanwhile, Rebecca continued speaking publicly about construction schedules and completion dates, as though ownership had already been settled. Watching everything unfold, I gradually stopped trying to convince anyone with opinions. From that day forward, every photograph, every conversation, every email, and every newly placed stake became another carefully preserved piece of evidence, waiting for the moment when confidence would finally meet the unchanging reality recorded inside the county courthouse decades earlier. The construction crews returned before sunrise 2 days later, and this time there was no hesitation in their movements. The deep rumble of excavators rolled across the pasture, while flatbed trailers delivered another wave of mature oak trees, pallets of decorative limestone, landscape lighting, irrigation equipment, and neatly stacked flowering shrubs. Cool morning air carried the familiar scent of damp clay, fresh mulch, and diesel exhaust as the first rays of sunlight reflected from chrome bumpers lined along the subdivision entrance. What had started as a few survey stakes was quickly becoming a permanent landscape stretching farther across my property with every passing hour. I drove my utility vehicle toward the eastern boundary, carrying my certified survey, copies of the recorded deed, and a folder containing the county plat. Several contractors recognized me from the previous meeting and paused long enough to hear what I had to say. I unfolded the survey across the hood of a pickup truck and pointed directly at the steel survey monument, standing only a few feet away. Everything beyond this line belongs to me, I said calmly. I am asking you again to stop until this boundary is verified. The foreman studied the survey carefully before looking toward Rebecca. She walked over without rushing, still carrying her clipboard beneath one arm, and listened with an expression that suggested the conversation had already been settled long before I arrived. We have a schedule to keep, she said evenly. The entrance improvement has already been approved. I answered just as calmly. Approval does not extend ownership beyond the legal boundary. For a brief moment, nobody spoke. Even the crane operator held the next tree suspended above the planting hole while waiting for direction. Rebecca glanced at the survey marker, then toward the architectural rendering rolled beneath her arm. Finally, she gave a small nod to the foreman. Within seconds, engines accelerated again, steel tracks rolled forward, and another mature oak slowly descended into soil that had never belonged to the homeowners association. Workers connected irrigation lines beneath the root ball, spread rich black mulch around the trunk, installed decorative limestone edging, and positioned landscape lighting exactly as shown on the presentation boards. I quietly stepped aside and photographed every stage of the work. Tire tracks crossing the survey ribbon, excavator buckets digging beyond the recorded boundary, irrigation trenches extending across my pasture. Each image automatically recorded the date, time, and location. By midday, the entrance looked remarkably polished. Fresh sod covered disturbed ground, flowering shrubs framed the newly planted trees, and decorative benches arrived on another trailer waiting to be installed beside the stone borders. Passing drivers slowed to admire what appeared to be a beautiful community improvement. None of them knew they were looking at private property transformed without permission. Before leaving the site, I handed Rebecca one final printed copy of the certified survey together with a written notice explaining that the work extended onto my land. She accepted the documents without reading them and tucked them beneath her clipboard. "You worry too much," she said with a confident smile before turning back toward the contractors. I watched another truck unload additional materials while automatic sprinklers were tested for the first time, sending a fine mist across freshly planted grass. The project was becoming more expensive by the hour, and strangely, that no longer concerned me. Every new tree, every irrigation valve, every decorative stone, and every completed improvement installed after my documented warnings strengthened the same simple truth. They were no longer creating a beautiful entrance. They were carefully building the evidence that would eventually prove they had chosen to ignore the property line on purpose. By the end of the following week, the entrance looked exactly the way Rebecca had promised the neighborhood it would. Towering oak trees framed the roadway with perfect symmetry. Fresh black mulch covered every landscape bed, decorative limestone curved around each trunk, and elegant lighting illuminated the entire entrance every evening just before sunset. Automatic sprinklers activated every morning with a gentle rhythmic hiss, sending a fine mist across grass that legally belonged to me. It was difficult to deny that the finished project looked beautiful. That was precisely why I refused to argue about appearances anymore. Beauty had never changed a deed, and popularity had never rewritten a county survey. Friends occasionally stopped by and asked why I was allowing everything to continue. Some assumed I had reached an agreement with the homeowners association. Others wondered whether the boundary had been uncertain all along. Instead of debating, I simply walked them to the original galvanized steel survey monument, standing quietly beneath one of the newly planted oak trees. I showed them the orange survey ribbon, the certified survey, and the recorded county plat. Every person who looked at the documents understood the same thing within minutes. The property line had never moved. Only the landscaping had crossed it. Every morning before leaving for work, I photographed the entrance from the exact same locations using the same camera settings, so the progression remained perfectly documented. Every afternoon, I launched my drone from the pasture and captured aerial images showing the irrigation system, decorative stone borders, landscape lighting, and mature oak trees extending beyond the legal boundary. Every evening, I organized photographs, contractor vehicle information, construction dates, invoices that became publicly available through association records, and copies of every conversation into a chronological archive inside my workshop. The collection gradually stopped looking like a folder of documents and began looking like a complete timeline that told the entire story without needing a single opinion. I also met with my attorney several more times as the project continued growing. Together, we reviewed every survey, every county record, every photograph, every certified letter, and every email exchanged with the association. After quietly studying the expanding file, he smiled and said something that immediately reminded me of my grandfather. The strongest property cases are usually won long before anyone enters a courtroom. They are won by the person who prepares the best record. Those words stayed with me as another glossy community newsletter arrived in my mailbox a few days later. The cover featured smiling board members standing proudly beneath the new oak trees while celebrating the completion of the entrance improvement. Inside, the association thanked residents for supporting the project and announced that future maintenance costs for irrigation, lighting, seasonal landscaping, tree care, and decorative stone restoration had officially been added to the annual operating budget. I carefully placed the newsletter into the same binder that already contained my surveys, photographs, certified correspondence, and county records. Every publication issued after my documented warnings quietly strengthened the evidence, showing the association openly accepted responsibility for improvements constructed on my land. That evening, I stood alone beside the eastern pasture while automatic sprinklers softly watered the freshly planted trees. Warm summer air carried the scent of wet mulch, cedar, and newly cut grass beneath the glow of landscape lights stretching across the entrance. Rebecca believed the growing investment protected the project from ever being questioned. Standing beside the original survey monument, I realized she had unknowingly built something far more valuable than a landscaped entrance. She had created an increasingly complete record proving that every additional dollar spent after receiving clear legal notice became another deliberate decision that would eventually be impossible to explain away. The answer that finally changed everything was not hidden beneath the new landscaping. It had been sitting quietly inside the county archives for years, waiting for someone willing to read every page instead of assuming someone else already had. Early the following Tuesday, I drove to the county records office carrying nothing more than my survey binder, a legal pad, and enough patience to spend the entire day comparing documents. The courthouse was quiet except for the soft turning of ceiling fans and the faint smell of old paper mixed with fresh coffee drifting through the records department. Shelves filled with subdivision plats, easement filings, survey maps, and development approvals stretched farther than I expected. A clerk pointed me toward the original subdivision files, and within minutes I found myself tracing legal descriptions line by line across maps that had been recorded decades before the first house in the neighborhood was ever built. After several hours, one particular document immediately stood out. It was the original subdivision boundary exhibit bearing the county surveyor's certification and official recording stamp. Every measurement matched the certified survey I had commissioned after inheriting my property. More importantly, the approved landscape corridor stopped precisely at the subdivision boundary. Not approximately. Not generally. Exactly. I continued reviewing the development records and discovered that the landscape permits, irrigation approvals, and lighting plans all referenced the same legal property limits. None of the approved construction documents authorized improvements beyond the association-owned land. Every mature oak tree, irrigation line, decorative stone border, and landscape light installed across my pasture existed outside the approved project area. I requested certified copies of every relevant record before leaving the courthouse. The clerk casually mentioned that very few people ever examined the original planning documents because most relied on newer presentation drawings instead. I thanked her, secured the records inside my binder, and drove home beneath a clear blue Texas sky with the windows rolled down while the scent of cedar and freshly cut hay drifted through the truck. Back in my workshop, I spread every document across the drafting table where I normally reviewed engineering plans. The county boundary exhibit aligned perfectly beside my certified survey. Drone photographs matched every measurement. My daily construction photographs corresponded exactly with association newsletters announcing project milestones. Every email, certified letter, and timestamp connected naturally with the next piece of evidence until the entire sequence became impossible to misunderstand. That evening, I prepared one final certified notice addressed to Rebecca Whitmore and every member of the Homeowners Association board. Inside the envelope, I included copies of the original boundary exhibit, the recorded subdivision plat, relevant permit pages, my certified survey, selected aerial photographs, and a professional letter explaining that unauthorized improvements remained on privately owned land. The letter respectfully requested that all additional work cease immediately and offered one final opportunity to resolve the matter before further legal action became necessary. Several days later, the delivery receipt confirmed the association had accepted the package. I waited quietly. 1 day passed, then 3, then an entire week. No telephone call arrived. No meeting was requested. No surveyor appeared to challenge my documentation. Instead, another contractor truck delivered decorative benches while fresh mulch was spread beneath the same mature oak trees identified. In my certified notice, standing beside the original galvanized steel survey monument that evening while automatic sprinklers quietly watered grass legally belonging to me, I realized the disagreement had crossed an important line. This was no longer a misunderstanding about property boundaries. It had become a documented decision to ignore certified records after receiving formal legal notice. From that moment forward, every additional improvement completed by the association no longer weakened my position. It quietly strengthened every page already waiting inside my binder. The final deadline expired quietly, almost unnoticed, and that silence told me everything I needed to know. Rebecca and the Homeowners Association had received every certified document, every survey, every county record, and every opportunity to correct the mistake before it became significantly more expensive. They chose to continue as though none of it existed. Instead of preparing for another conversation, I began preparing for the day every decision would finally be measured against the facts. My attorney and I assembled the complete record into a single indexed binder. The first section contained my recorded deed and certified survey. The next included the original subdivision plat, boundary exhibit, and development approvals obtained from the county records office. After that came the photographs documenting the first orange construction stakes, the daily progress of the landscaping, the contractor equipment crossing the survey line, and the completed entrance after every warning had already been delivered. Drone photographs showed the entire project from above, making the property boundary impossible to misunderstand. Certified mail receipts, emails, newsletters, meeting notes, and delivery confirmations completed the timeline. Every page naturally supported the one before it until the entire story could be understood without anyone offering a personal opinion. My attorney looked across the drafting table and quietly smiled. Now we simply allow the process to work. The following week, a licensed surveyor returned carrying modern global positioning system equipment capable of verifying every original monument with remarkable precision. We spent the better part of the morning walking the eastern boundary beneath clear blue skies, while a gentle breeze carried the familiar scent of cedar, fresh grass, and damp soil left behind by the irrigation system the association had installed. One by one, the surveyor uncovered each galvanized steel monument, confirmed every coordinate, and stretched bright orange survey ribbon between them. The straight line passed directly through decorative stone borders, irrigation valves, landscape lighting, flowering shrubs, and the trunks of mature oak trees. The surveyor paused beside the final monument before quietly saying, "The legal boundary has never changed. Everything else crossed it." Hearing those words felt less like a victory and more like confirmation of something I had known from the very beginning. That afternoon, I met with a contractor specializing in relocating mature trees using hydraulic tree spades. He carefully reviewed the survey, inspected the root systems, and explained that each tree could be professionally removed and relocated with minimal disturbance to the surrounding ground. The irrigation contractor outlined a step-by-step plan for shutting down and disconnecting each underground zone. A drone operator scheduled continuous aerial documentation of the entire operation from start to finish. My attorney also notified the county sheriff's office in advance that licensed contractors would be performing authorized work on privately owned land supported by certified surveys and recorded documents, so there would be no confusion if concerned residents reported unusual activity. Every detail was handled openly, professionally, and according to established procedure. The evening before the scheduled work, I walked alone along the eastern pasture as landscape lights illuminated the entrance and automatic sprinklers quietly watered the rows of mature oak trees. I stopped beside the original steel survey monument, brushed away a thin layer of fresh mulch from its base, and rested my hand on the cool galvanized metal. It had remained exactly where it belonged through every presentation, every newsletter, every promise, and every expensive improvement. Rebecca believed permanence came from finishing the project before anyone could stop it. I knew permanence came from a property line that had never moved, and by sunrise the facts recorded decades earlier would finally become impossible for anyone to ignore. The morning arrived exactly as the surveyor had predicted. A cool breeze drifted across the pasture while the first light of dawn reflected from dew resting on the native grass. At precisely 7 o'clock, the first contractor truck entered through my gate, followed by the licensed surveyor, the irrigation specialists, the tree relocation crew, and the drone operator whose aircraft quietly lifted into the clear Texas sky within minutes. Every person carried identification, insurance certificates, work orders, and copies of the certified survey. Nothing about the operation was rushed because nothing needed to be. The surveyor began by uncovering each original galvanized steel monument and verifying every coordinate with global positioning system equipment. Bright orange survey ribbons stretched from marker to marker, forming a perfectly straight line that cut directly through decorative stone borders, irrigation valves, landscape lighting, flower beds, and the trunks of mature oak trees. Standing there, the entire situation suddenly became remarkably simple. The property line had remained exactly where it had always been. Only the landscaping had crossed it. Once the measurements were completed, The irrigation contractor shut down the underground system one zone at a time before carefully disconnecting each section. The quiet hiss of running water gradually faded until the only sounds remaining were birds singing across the pasture and the low mechanical hum of the hydraulic tree spade positioning itself around the first oak tree. Heavy steel blades slowly entered the soil before lifting the entire root ball in one controlled motion. Rich black earth clung to the roots as the crane gently rotated toward a waiting transport trailer. Every movement mirrored the careful installation that had taken place only weeks earlier, except this time every action followed the authority granted by the lawful property owner and supported by certified records. Before the second tree was relocated, a white sport utility vehicle stopped near the entrance. Rebecca stepped out holding the same clipboard she had carried since the project began. Her confident expression faded the moment she saw the survey ribbon extending through the completed landscaping. She walked quickly toward the surveyor before turning to me. "You cannot remove community property," she said, trying to maintain the certainty she had displayed for months. I answered calmly, "This has always been private property. The documents have not changed." One of the contractors respectfully handed her copies of the certified survey together with my attorney's contact information. She looked at the papers without accepting them and immediately placed a telephone call. Less than 30 minutes later, a deputy from the county sheriff's office arrived after receiving the advance notification my attorney had previously provided. He greeted everyone professionally, reviewed the work orders, compared the certified survey with the original survey monuments, and spent several minutes speaking privately with the licensed surveyor. When he finished, he calmly explained that the documentation supported authorized work on privately owned land and that he had no legal basis to interfere. The conversation remained respectful from beginning to end. Around us, the operation continued with remarkable precision. Mature oak trees were carefully relocated one after another. Decorative limestone was stacked neatly onto pallets for removal. Landscape lighting was disconnected without damage. Irrigation components were removed systematically while the drone documented every stage from above. I remained beside the original steel survey monument as the final oak tree slowly rose from the ground and settled onto the last waiting trailer. Weeks earlier, Rebecca had smiled confidently while telling me that once those trees were planted, nobody would ever remove them. Watching the final truck leave beneath the bright Texas morning sky, I realized that expensive projects can create impressive entrances, but they can never erase a property line that has already been measured, recorded, and patiently defended. The weeks that followed unfolded with a calm I had almost forgotten was possible. Once the unauthorized landscaping had been professionally removed, the eastern edge of my property slowly began looking like itself again. A restoration contractor carefully graded the disturbed soil, filled the irrigation trenches, removed the remaining construction materials, and reseeded the pasture with native grass. Within a short time, the fresh green growth blended naturally into the surrounding landscape until it became difficult to imagine that dozens of mature oak trees, decorative stone borders, landscape lighting, and an elaborate entrance had ever stood there at all. The only feature that remained exactly as it had from the very beginning was the original galvanized steel survey monument quietly marking the boundary where it had always been. A few weeks later, I installed a simple split rail fence following the certified property line from one monument to the next. Near the eastern corner, I added a modest metal sign identifying the land as private property according to the recorded county survey. It was not designed to impress anyone. It existed only to make one simple fact impossible to misunderstand. The legal process continued over the following months exactly as my attorney had predicted. Rather than creating unnecessary courtroom drama, both sides exchanged documentation, reviewed certified surveys, and negotiated a formal settlement supported by the county records that neither opinion nor confidence could contradict. The Homeowners Association ultimately agreed to reimburse documented restoration expenses, correct internal maps that had incorrectly shown the entrance extending beyond association property, and require independent boundary verification before approving any future construction projects near neighboring landowners. Those changes mattered far more to me than any reimbursement ever could because they greatly reduced the chance that another property owner would experience the same situation. Not long afterward, I learned that Rebecca, Whitmore was no longer serving as president of the Homeowners Association. I never asked for details, and honestly, I never felt the need to celebrate. My goal had never been to embarrass another person. It had simply been to protect land that had belonged to my family for generations. Over the next several months, a surprising number of homeowners stopped by my property while walking through the area. Some apologized for assuming the entrance had been built in the correct location simply because it looked official. Others admitted they had trusted presentation boards and newsletters without realizing the original county records told a completely different story. I never criticized them. Instead, I showed anyone who asked the original survey monument, the certified survey, and the recorded plat. Every conversation ended the same way. Facts quietly replaced assumptions. Even now, I still enjoy walking the eastern pasture during the evening, just as my grandfather once did. The breeze still carries the scent of cedar after a light rain. Meadowlarks still settle along the fence line before sunset, and the open fields remain peacefully unchanged despite everything that happened. Sometimes I stop beside that old steel survey monument and remember Rebecca confidently saying that once the trees were planted, nobody would ever remove them. She believed permanence came from money, appearance, and momentum. My grandfather understood something far simpler. Land remembers every decision people make upon it, but the law remembers them as well. Property lines are not determined by confidence, popularity, or expensive landscaping. They are determined by recorded truth patiently preserved over time. Looking back, I realized the greatest lesson was never about winning a dispute with a homeowners association. It was about understanding that justice rarely arrives with loud arguments or dramatic confrontations. More often it arrives through preparation, patience, careful documentation, and the quiet certainty that the truth does not have to compete with assumptions because eventually it will always be measured for exactly what it is.